So thank you all for joining us today. For the next hour or so, we're just really hoping to go through really a TRI basics and kind of one step beyond. So TRI reporting. In particular, my name is Melissa Dakas. I am with Montrose Environmental. For those of you who aren't familiar with Montrose, we are a full service environmental consulting firm. I'll go into a little bit about us, but I also want to introduce my colleague, Sandra Alvarado. I'm based out of Austin, and she's San Antonio. But yeah, we just kind of want to walk you through, like I said, TRI basics, just kind of for a quick poll of the audience. Who has actually done TRI reporting? Kind of maybe what level or familiar are you with TRI? All done? Okay. All right. Intro for some individuals? Perfect. Okay. Just so I can know who. I would like this to be somewhat conversational, so please feel free to ask questions. Let's talk through this. We want to present information, but I also want it to be, incredibly, informative for everyone in the audience in this case. So who is Montrose Environmental? So as I mentioned, we are a full service environmental compliance firm. We offer multidisciplinary, not only consulting and permitting and compliance, but we also have testing services, LDAR, remediation, groundwater, biogas solutions, kind of the whole suite. It's a firm that's been made up of a lot of different acquisitions as well as growing organically. So we're kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to your environmental needs. You'll see a lot of folks represented in Montrose, here at the conference, indicating some of our different expertise. Headquartered in Orange County, California, although we're moving that headquarters actually to Arkansas here in the near term. But we have over 2,000 employees, and we really are both a nationwide, but also an international company. As I mentioned, it's kind of our continuum of services. We do offer all of the different areas, again, of environmental needs, really from a regulatory standpoint. I'm just going to touch on a couple here that are kind of applicable to this topic in particular. One, as I mentioned, regulatory consulting. That's who Sandra and I are here representing. We do, she and I are both air quality professionals in this case, so this is our area of expertise. But water, waste, industrial hygiene, et cetera, are all services that our compliance folks also help clients in support of. Along with TRI, since TRI is actually reporting and it is actual emissions, so we're going to talk about what those are. There's different ways to actually monitor and measure those types of emissions. So I wanted to just highlight our testing and lab services real quick. We have both stack testing as well as analytical labs, source testing, soil, water, sediment, all of the different aspects that you might actually need as part of your TRI reporting. Combined with that also is we have a leak detection repair line of our business that does all of that, again, monitoring and direct measurement of those types of things. That'll come into play a little bit more when we talk about how do you actually report these emissions under your TRI. So what we hope to kind of accomplish real quick is just go through kind of general, what is TRI, the basics form are, get into some examples, recent updates, and then obviously open it up to questions. Where did TRI come from? Really kind of dating back to the 1980s. The Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act came on board as a direct response to the Bipole India catastrophe that killed over 2,000 people. It's really providing a way for companies to for the community, I should say, and companies to not only report what they have stored on site, what they're releasing on site, in order to prepare, for communities to be aware and to prep accordingly for any type of issue. We're only going to focus on Section 313, which is the chemical release reporting, but the other portions of this rule cover emergency planning and notification, emergency release. So any release that you might have on site would get reported, in addition to your storage. So under 311 and 312, it is what is your chemical inventory storage that you're going to report. So how much do folks have on site? And then finally, we're going to get into more in depth into the 313. But each of these subsets of the rule kind of all interplay with one another and provide the community with information that they need to be able to be aware and to react necessary to situations. So what is Section 313 in the TRI? This particular section requires facilities to file a report for a group of chemicals. Right now, there's about 770 on the list that exceed a particular activity threshold. So we're going to go in. I think, to be honest with you, the most difficult part of the TRI reporting is determining if you need to report and what you need to report. Once you get to that, actually determining your emissions is, I feel, a very straightforward piece, but my portion of the presentation is going to kind of be walking you through how to determine what and if a facility would need to report under TRI. The chemical list, as I mentioned, is about 770. It changes every year pretty much. I think over the last couple of years, we keep seeing additions to that. So every single year, it is imperative to review as you're preparing your TRI report to look at what are those chemicals that are listed there, what is, when added, what has been changed in this case. So in order to determine whether or not you would report, you have to go through a couple of different threshold evaluations. One is this only defines under certain covered sectors. So those are defined by our NACs, our codes in this case. There are sectors that do not require reporting. There's an easy list on the EPA website in order to go through and determine whether or not that is, but that's the first level of review of determining whether you would report. Next, the idea is to, again, target larger facilities. So they've defined that as having 10 or more full-time employees. So small outfits, again, would not be required to report under this particular regulation. The reports are submitted directly to EPA and often to the designated state officials and/or tribal office. It is due on July 1st, following the reporting year. So for 2021, it will be submitted by July 1st, 2022. So you have about 6 months in order to do that calculation in this case. So what are the reporting requirements? I love a good flow chart. What's the go, no go? So first, determining whether or not your facility is covered as a covered facility in the types of operations. If it is not, you stop. You don't have to worry about this particular rule. 2, do you have more than the 10 employees? They average that out to say more than about 20,000 man hours per year that are operated, yes or no. And then we're going to get into, or I'm going to go into more detail here, is whether or not you manufacture, process, or otherwise use APCA 313 listed chemicals. That's the piece where we have to take a look at the threshold, not on how much you release, but what meets those particular definitions in this particular case. If you do exceed the threshold, as we'll talk about, then you would determine how much emissions you have of those particular chemicals and report those under your TRI reporting. We talk about this a little bit later, but I like to kind of just quickly up front and go through what is manufacture, process, and otherwise used in regards to the TRI reporting. I'm not going to read to you necessarily the definition, but they are generally what you would imagine. Manufacture is actually creating a chemical. In that sense, you are producing it. It is created as part of what your operations might be. Process is a little bit more on, we'll call it is a chemical that you use in some ways. You might repackage it. It might be a mixture, but it is incorporated into a product that you're producing, in this case, at your facility. And then everything else might fall under this otherwise used category. So that's going to include chemicals you might use in cleaning or other processes that are not directly related maybe to your actual manufacturing process and things. We'll go into that a little bit more detail, but since I talk about these definitions a lot in the next couple of slides, I just wanted to give you a little bit up front on how we define those and what they are in that framework. So what is the TRI process? It goes apart. There's 2 parts. We kind of split this up, and this is how we're sharing the presentation a little bit. I'm going to take you through the step 1 of that. One, it is, again, identifying which of the Section 313 chemicals you have on your facility, and then determining whether or not that they meet the thresholds that we'll discuss. Once you've determined whether or not you bin those chemicals into the manufactured, processed, or otherwise used categories, comparing those to the actual thresholds will then determine whether or not you actually report your emissions of those particular chemicals. If the threshold is then exceeded, you then move to determining what is the amount of those materials that are released, whether it be to air, water, waste. So it is how are any of those released again to those particular different media, and that is what's reported on your Form Rs that we'll go through. How do you file the TRI? I guess we'll get the basics out of the way. It's done through the EPA TRIME website through that. So it's electronic filing. In this case, there are some states that have some unique nuances that go along with that. It might be additional fees or some additional filing, but primarily this is going directly to EPA. All of this information is available online. It can be searched by facility all through the EPA website. So this is publicly available information. What is submitted is actually available, all information available to the public. I always put this little caveat here, so I think it's important to recognize, especially here in Texas, this reporting program is being done in conjunction with a lot of other environmental reports, specifically things such as air, so your emissions inventory, annual waste summaries, et cetera. Because you're reporting your releases of various media and you're reporting those in other places, it's really important to ensure that all of your reports and your reported emissions match. Specifically here in Texas, that's one of the things that they will absolutely look at for facilities is comparing what your TRI reported emissions are, for example, on air sources to what you've reported in your emissions inventory and whether or not that they jive. If not, they're going to ask questions as to why. So although this is an independent reporting requirement, it does coincide with the other air, water, or waste reports that you might have for a facility. So how do we determine whether or not you are going to report under TRI? As I mentioned, the first step of looking at that is determining whether or not the particular chemicals in question, those 770, fall under the category of manufactured. Within manufactured, that also means imported. So even if you're not necessarily manufacturing, if you are the import of that material, meaning it is coming from external to the United States, you would define that and include that within the manufactured category. Next is the process, and finally, it's the otherwise used. As you see, there's actually a differentiator in the actual threshold. So for the first two, we were looking at 25,000 pounds. The last one is a 10,000 pound threshold. So that is going to be calculating not your releases, but the actual use or the manufacture of the products at your facility. There's also a group of chemicals that have a different threshold. So those, as they call them, the PBT chemicals are the persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So this small group has a much different threshold in which you would determine whether or not you're going to be reported. So within that list of 700 plus, these have a lower activity threshold, and we'll take a look at what those are in particular. But that's very much to note in making sure, again, when you're looking at all of the different chemicals within a facility, whether or not they fall under the typical activity thresholds or whether you have to compare them to this other grouping. So without going into the actual numbers, this is just a nice representation of what they are. But we started with thresholds of about 25,000 pounds. Under these particular chemicals, we're looking at a 10, 100, or actually a 0.1 gram per year threshold. So it's very easy for these highly reactive chemicals to meet a reporting threshold in the case if you do process it or utilize them at a facility. Yeah.
Is that the same, the otherwise used? It's the same threshold for all three, it's not any differentiation?
Correct. That is correct. So when trying to determine, kind of again, that first step is looking at that current list. The list of chemicals is identified by not only the CAS number, the individual chemical name, and there's also chemical qualifiers, which will define what those are in the categories. There are a number of chemical categories that will describe. So in some cases, you're looking at a specific chemical by name, or you're actually looking at a category, which would be a group of chemicals that would fall under that. And in that case, you're actually looking at all of any chemical that would fall under that category and summing those together to do your threshold comparison. So as I mentioned, here's chemicals with qualifiers. anyone who's preparing a TRI or doing a threshold determination really needs to have that list as provided by EPA handy in order to look at these and look at every chemical that you might look at. Qualifiers, is some of the examples that we have here, are showing that you may utilize, you may produce something, but if it doesn't fall within that qualifier, a good example is isopropyl alcohol. That's a very common use in industry. Folks have it all over. However, it only would fall into a threshold calculation if it is manufactured using a strong acid process. So it's a very limited, defined definition of when you would include isopropyl alcohol into your threshold determination. Other uses of it would be exempt from having to determine under the threshold determination. Similar to with sulfuric acid, the qualifier here is only if it's an acid aerosol. So in other words, if you have an aqueous sulfuric acid tank, that is very different than an actual acid aerosol. So it's understanding and making sure you recognize what form of the chemical you have or utilizing at your facility and whether or not it would meet the qualifier in order to do that threshold determination. As I mentioned too, there's also some chemical categories just to make it even more confusing. So not only do you have 770 chemicals that you have to evaluate, there's a list of about, I think it's about 30 chemical categories also that would fall into some different compounds. Many of these are metal chemical compounds in this case. So if you have anything that would include one of these particular metals, then you would actually have to add up the total weight of the entire compound as part of your threshold determination, in this case, not the subcomponent of each of the individual units. In some one-off categories, you might have a particular chemical that would fall not only as its standalone as its own, but also be part of a chemical category. You would actually do a threshold determination on each of those independently. So although we're kind of showing on the screen mostly the metal categories, one is I think glycol ethers. There's a number of chemicals that would fall under the glycol ether umbrella, and you would look at each of those individuals, but then also look at the glycol ether category as a whole and comparing those to your thresholds. As with everything, there are exceptions to every rule, which is why it's great to read the notes and to make sure that you're looking at the chemical list of what may or may not be included. There are some exceptions to each of those. So if we get into a little bit more of the meat of what is manufacture, processing, and otherwise used. So we identified what the definition of that was. So now if we go into more on a little bit of examples of manufacturing activities. So really it's intentionally producing a chemical for purposes of sale or distribution, on-site use or processing. There's also this category of, we say, coincidental producing chemicals as impurities or byproducts. A great example of this is fuel combustion. So that is a byproduct of the actual combustion of fuel. Other examples that would kind of go into that, even if that's not the intent of what you were producing, but that is a byproduct. It falls into this chemical category for the threshold determination. We talked about importing. So anything that, again, you are bringing in, you are considered the import location for that, falls into this particular activity for your threshold. Processing activities is really another way of, I almost want to say, a little bit of a pass-through. It's using materials without changing their actual properties in this case. So could it be a reactant? Could you be repackaging something for distribution? Could it be a blending operation? Again, you're not actually manufacturing, but a good example of this is if you utilize toluene as an additive to paint. So by mixing that as part of your paint, you're processing that particular chemical in this case. Repackaging is considered a processing activity. And so it's defined, uniquely, especially in the case of removing, let's say, receiving a tanker truck and then ultimately distributing something in drums, that is considered a repackaging, even though you aren't changing anything about the material. As it qualifies, goes through your facility, it would be considered under a repackaging activity and a processing activity to the threshold. And so this is determining how much of that material you have utilized or has under that particular activity throughout the entire year as part of that threshold determination. So this is not emissions, this isn't releases, this is just how much of each chemical did you utilize within one of these activity definitions at the facility. And then finally, the otherwise use. So this is, again, chemical processing, manufacturing aids, and auxiliary activities. Just, I call this the catch-all category. It's anything that isn't exempt for another reason, but it would fall under your otherwise use category. So just a couple of kind of quick examples in looking at this. So if you have a covered facility that was a coal-fired boiler, the combustion of coal generates aerosol forms of hydrochloric acid as a byproduct. Are the aerosol forms of hydrochloric acid required to be reported? The answer is yes. So again, it's not something you're specifically manufacturing, but coincidental manufactures that aerosol as that byproduct of the coal, of a coal-fired boiler. So if that aerosol is calculated to be greater than 200 or 25,000 pounds, you would be reporting that as under the manufacturing activity. I think this is an example I use. So again, if a facility combines toluene with other materials to form paint, is it a manufacturer, process, or otherwise used? That would be a process, an example of a process activity. You're not changing the toluene, but you are providing it within a mixture, and then therefore that would fall under that activity threshold. So more importantly, what are things that do not fall under threshold activities? Storage alone is not defined as a threshold activity unless you're doing something different. So as we say, again, moving material through on-site recycling, relabeling without repackaging. So if you do receive a material that literally you're just putting a different label on and then processing through, that would not fall under this. But changing the actual package of a material would be considered a threshold activity. So a couple of reporting exemptions, and I'm just going to go through these before I turn it over to Sandra, is I'm going to talk more about de minimis and article. Those are two unique areas. But other things that would fall under an exemption would be laboratory type activities. So chemicals you might use in a laboratory setting or within a facility. Otherwise use exemptions, motor vehicle maintenance as an example would fall into that. Janitorial activities, so again, cleaning type products, personal use, structural components. Another big one too, which is unique, intake water and air. So if you have a facility that uses large quantities of intake water, if there's already a contaminant present in that water as part of the intake, you're not going to be reporting it as a discharge also. So if you have high metals, for example, in your water that you're using, that's not considered part of something that you would calculate under this. So anything that's already present in any intake water or air that you're utilizing falls under a reporting exemption under TRI.
So you're saying you get back that
Yes, yeah. But what they're saying, they don't. But you're not held responsible for the fact, again, if you have high copper in the groundwater that you're pulling in that sense, because it's something that you've contributed to in that sense. But yeah, it's making sure you know what the ins and the outs look like in that. Absolutely. So de minimis exemptions. I think where this comes into play most significantly is when you have mixtures or compounds of various materials in which have large speciation information. There is a de minimis exemption based on the percentage of a chemical within a material. In most cases, it's going to fall into 1% or 0.1%, considering what the type of chemical is, if it's a carcinogen or a non-carcinogen. Those BPT chemicals don't fall into this. We'll talk about that in just a second. But generally speaking, if you do have a material that you can say that their 313 chemical is less than the 1% within it, then it is de minimis and does not have to be included in there. So this generally does apply to all non-PBT chemicals. Considering the release of those chemicals, the thresholds are so low in that we have to take into account any and all of those chemicals if they are present in a material, even if it is at a very minimal concentration. Note that this does not apply to manufacturer chemicals in most cases, so including the byproducts. So again, if you are creating these materials, in this case, we still have to look at what all of the speciation associated with that. And again, just know I'm still talking strictly about threshold calculations. But once all of this is determined and you know what chemicals you may actually have to report on, the next piece again is looking specifically at releases. But to me, I feel this is actually the bulk of the work in understanding for a facility, you know, what is it that meets these thresholds that you even have to consider. This is kind of a unique one, is that again, the de minimis cannot be applied to a PBD chemical. However, there is an exception in the sense that supplier notification, suppliers of mixtures don't necessarily have to notify you of what the concentrations of these items are, but if you are knowledgeable that you have something in there, you still have to account for it. So there is some information or some balance there of trying to understand you still have to account for these particular chemicals with whatever information that you do have available, even if the supplier of it did not notify you directly of what the concentrations would be in there. The final piece is, I think that this is a unique exemption. It's not applied very often because again, this is going to depend, it's really industry specific because it depends upon what it is, the product that you are. But if you have an article, so this is an article is defined as something that is formed into a specific shape and design during manufacture and has the end use dependent upon that particular shape in that sense and does not release a chemical under normal processing conditions or use at the facility. So something like that, if you think about a piece of sheet metal or something would be defined as an article. However, if you are, depending upon what you do with that sheet metal in and of itself may in fact be exempt under this unless there is a change in the form. So grinding, bending, changing it into something different than what it initially had. There is a proposed rulemaking that came out in February regarding this exemption specific to the wood products industry, because there's been some debate and question over the application of chemicals to actually the wood products and sealants and things, and how this would be defined. I personally haven't worked too much with the article exemption, so I'm not going to go into great, too much detail with this. But again, it's a very unique and defined exemption for really product specific type items. So here's just kind of two examples of what might be included or not. So again, if you have a wire that is cut to specific lengths, the wastes include off-spec cuts and dust. So the generation of the off-spec cuts that are recognized as the articles. So again, if it still looks like a piece of wire, that can meet the exemption. However, any of the dust or any of the other any pieces that are produced that do not look like that initial article, do not look like a piece of wire, are not exempt under this. So I know it seems a little, so it's kind of along the lines of, yes, if you started with a piece of wire, you may cut it to size. If it still looks like wire, that would be part of an article under the exemption. But grinding specks, bent pieces, something that does not look like that initial article as it was defined in that form, would fall under the threshold calculations. Oftentimes it's used, as they say, the watch area can be used, it's used in appropriate times. So this is just one to make sure that you really, give some thought and consideration if you're looking or think that this is an exemption that applies to you and whether or not it truly is. I'm going to turn over now that you've kind of determined your thresholds and things to Sandra to take us through the rest.
So once you've figured out that you will need to report The next portion is trying to actually do the quantification. Either that means you have enough materials at the facility or processing materials that are listed. Then you have to really figure out where you're going to get your information from. How do you quantify that? What materials are you using as resource information? That's typically going to be your safety data sheets, technical product data sheets, anything you can get from a vendor. So of course, you're going to be able to utilize that information. If you happen to get one of those nebulous SDSs that have zero information on them, basically we give the recommendation you really should make some effort to try to figure that out, contact the manufacturer, see what they can give you. If they can't give you anything, that's pretty much out of your control. So it's in your best interest, obviously, to try to document what you're able to get, that product information, any disclosed composition. But really, that's the best you can do. So typically, we start with those, the product data sheets, the SDSs, and then any other available information. So that's anything that you've got from process knowledge, from any analysis that you have on site, or any monitoring that you yourself do, your production information, your inventory. So it's just basically how much of this material are you using. So how much of the material you're using, what's in it, and how you can be able to calculate out really what your process amount was for that calendar year. Of course, a lot of the other things that you generally prepare throughout the year, including your waste profiles, your permit, any permits, air or water, your annual reports or your quarterly reports for that matter, and everything else that you pretty much already are or should be maintaining, you can use to really quantify all those things. So what here is, it's super helpful to actually know what's in the material. And of course, when the vendor gives you a specific concentration, such as 25% of a given material, then that would be what you're using to qualify. So 25% of that overall material, if it's a mixture or then you're looking at 25% of that mixture as the reportable quantity, or the threshold that we're really comparing against. There are times when they'll give you an upper bound. If that's all they're giving you, then you use the top end of that bound, of that range. If they give you an actual range where you've got a minimum and a maximum, then you take the midpoint. And then so here, as the example, between 30 and 50, then you would use, of course, the 40. There's these two situations where you've got a lower bound, then you've got to really look at what other information you have available. So in this case, 75% of the material that you're looking at has this toxic compound or chemical. Then you know that obviously you can't have more than 100%. So you use the midpoint between that 75 and that 100%. So 87.5% would be what you'd use to calculate it. The other option is, of course, you know that in this case, there's 15% water in the material. So if there's 15% water, that means it's 100 minus that 15%. So the maximum you could have in there is 85%. So it's the range between the 75 and the 85%. And that's your midpoint at that point is 80%. So if that's not confusing enough.
Just water.
Right. So you subtract what you know from that 100%. Obviously, you can't have more than 100% of material. So then you subtract it from 100%, and that's the maximum what you've had. So if you had other materials in addition to that water, that would be able to lower it down. So it's between 75 and 78% because you've subtracted all the other materials. Then that's the range you use. So we're looking at some examples for mixtures. Here we've got facilities using 15,000 pounds of an industrial solvent for cleaning. So we look at that SDS, of course, and it says that it contains 20% of non-hazardous surfactants. So we know that the maximum that it could have is at 80% at that point. So your range of at that point is the midpoint between over 50% tetrachloroethylene and less than 80%, because we know at least 20% of it is already accounted for. So I think that's kind of what you were hinting at right there. The midpoint between that 50 and 80% is 65. So 65% of the total purchased for or total used for that year would be what you're looking at against the thresholds. And so there you can follow out the math. That's 9750, which is just under the 10,000 pound threshold. So you don't have to report for that material for the year. In this case, because it's the otherwise used threshold, which is the 10,000 pounds. So when you're looking at, and this is section 5, and we'll look at a little bit later, the kind of the way the form is actually broken out, but the software doesn't necessarily match that. So the section where you actually have to account, where does everything go? The first step was, how much of it did you use? How much of it did you process? And then where does it all go? Here's the material balance portion. So these are your releases. How are they going out in air as either fugitive or as part of a stack, point source? Your discharges to water, underground injection. And so you've got to account for all of these as you do your material balances for each of these materials. Estimating the quantities, again, we look at the same kind of routine reporting that we typically follow. So if you're looking at your air emissions reporting, your annual emissions inventories, any DMRs that you're already reporting for, discharges, you're looking at anything that you have already that is quantifiable, justifiable, reasonable. And so you're legally bound to just use the best available information. If that means, like I said before, you make a concerted effort to get better information if your vendors can't provide you something on an SDS. So, but they're not expecting you to make it up either. So anything that you have already measured, monitored, or any technical product data that you have is really the best you can do.
Some places we use 0, some we use.
We typically will recommend the 0. So that means you could have it available. And we actually go into that a little bit further in one of the slides, but typically you'll say for that year in particular, your data tells you that you didn't have anything going out. And so we'd actually report 0 because that is the best available information for that. So here's what to report. This is a lot of, the quantification that you typically do for your emissions inventory. Any direct measurements that you have go towards your stack emissions or fugitive emissions. And then, of course, default EPA factors and best guesstimates where available for fugitive emissions, stack emissions, and then, of course, storage tanks. There's always available data or, of course, any monitoring information that you have available to you there. A variety of different options for your surface water discharges. And so, again, really the idea is to try to account for anywhere that you are potentially releasing this material. So as you do material balances, again, if you have sampling data or any kind of estimates that you may have, account for those each year based on what available information you have to surface water and similar to waste. So I'm not gonna read all the bullets, just a quick flash here, and then talking a little bit more about the layout of the actual Form R report. So if you're typically using the software, you can just follow the process, and their way of laying it out makes pretty good sense. So here it's just, they've split it up into 2 parts when you're actually looking at the form. The first part is for the facility information. It's 5 different sections that covers parent company, number of employees, those kind of first elements that you had to go through to make sure that you were subject to reporting. So there's not an exemption that covered you. You did have enough employee count to be able to, or to have to report. These are the places where all that information goes in the first 5 fields. After that, it covers the chemical specific, and you're going to have 1 form per chemical. So the last 8 sections are really what happens to that chemical. How did you use it, manufacture it, or process it? And where does it actually end up? So all of those different release pathways, how did you account for it in the end? So this is where we're talking about the NA or 0. You have to make a judgment call when you come in and basically report as a 0. And it's important to understand the difference between an NA not applicable and a 0. So not applicable is if you don't recycle it on site, that's NA. It doesn't apply to your facility, doesn't apply to this particular chemical or this particular process. But if at some point, let's talk about, I guess, discharging to the water, you have a 0 because you have, data that shows you that you're not actually discharging. But if something were to go differently in the water chemistry, in the control equipment, they might have a year where you're actually going to be able to measure that. You find some of that in the actual water sampling. Then you're going to need to report 0 because that is, to the best of our knowledge, we do not have any in the water stream. However, we could. And so that's, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
I've typically used the how section in those scenarios, but yeah, if it's something that could absolutely be present, in that case, then that's what I've typically done. I think it varies in certain circumstances and with the release of the media and the test.
I don't know.
But no, but that's very common.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's all, as in every place, there's different codes that you have to use to identify your methods of calculation. So basis of estimate meant basically what were the processes that you went about to come up with this value. And I don't remember the codes off the top of my head, sorry. But, it's everything from an estimate to a measurement. And so were these, standard EPA factors that you use to calculate something, or was it something that was actually monitored for the site specific for that year? This is kind of a little bit more of a rare, I guess, opportunity, but if specific criteria are met, you can use a Form R in lieu of a Form A in lieu of a Form R. And that's basically where you have no detailed release, other waste management or source reporting. It allows you basically to reduce your reporting requirements. You must maintain the records and the quantification calculations to show really that you met the criteria. And then if you qualify, then it would be for the chemicals that you meet that criteria. For the others, you could use the Form R still. So you can do some combination of the two. So here's the actual list of criteria. You can't exceed 1 million pounds of a toxic chemical or 500 pounds, and it can't be a PBT, or 500 pounds of waste management releases. And so this is for essentially for the layout of Section 8. This may not make a whole lot of sense if you haven't done one of these before, but Section 8 is basically the sum of all of those releases and recycling on site, transfer to landfill, all of the different kind of waste management pathways. And so in this case, it must be the equivalent of the sum of all of those different paths. So one of the very confusing parts of this is how do you report a metal? If it's a metal or a metal compound, there are different, again, what Melissa had gone through is some of the criteria that had, manganese. Manganese compounds might be manganese oxide, or is it elemental manganese? And so that's really where you have to turn around and look at the material, look at the EPA lists of lists, as they love to call it, and really look at whether you're dealing with a compound or the elemental metal. the different chemicals with qualifiers. Be sure that you're very clear as to whether or not you have to report. You don't want to report for something that, was excluded. The acid mists is something that would be very specific. You're obviously, even if you're processing the acids, unless it's an open bath or you have a, some kind of mist or scrubber or someplace where you could have a wet aerosol, then really just the use of it, the processing wouldn't necessarily be reported. And then, of course, the extra awareness on the PBTs, because the thresholds are, of course, lower, or the calculation thresholds when you're looking at the composition of a material. So we're going to go and do a couple of the examples. This is just a simple coating. It's applied to an aluminum coil, and it includes xylene, toluene, and then, of course, some pigment. So we'd have to go through the calculation for these, looking at all of the metal compounds that are inside of it, and then the solvent portion. And we're looking at the processing because, in this case, when you're applying that coating, the solids, of course, are going to adhere to the material. They're not going to be emitted. And in this case, they are part of they become part of the product. So you're processing this material, it's being adhered to the product, it remains with the product. And then the solvent itself is being used to transfer it to that product. So that's going to evaporate, it's actually going to leave the product, it's not going to remain with it. And so that is actually qualifying as otherwise used. For a forest products company that is applying the coating to wood, then we're looking at methanol, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde is a product of the reaction. And in this case, we're looking at the product in the reaction, and so that becomes part of being manufactured. And then the otherwise used of methanol and formaldehyde, again, because they don't remain with the product in the end. For combustion, we're looking at a coal to steam. So we're looking at the actual compounds in the coal, chromium, the lead, mercury, and then the emissions that are generated because of that combustion. So those include the fly ash, and those become a different threshold. Again, breaking it out to otherwise used, the materials that are part of the fuel as a contaminant, and those are considered otherwise used, and looking at, because the two are PBTs, they have no de minimis, whereas the chromium, which is not a PBT, then has the 1% threshold. So it would be reportable if you have the content over 1%. For the manufactured, then we have, of course, the emissions from the HCl, the dioxins, and the chromium compounds. Oh, okay, that was pretty much it. So what we've talked about a lot is the changes to the lists. That happens on an annual basis. They go back and they look at, for various different reasons, what materials must be added. So in 2019, no, that was early 2020. It feels like forever ago, but it was actually early 2020 when the National Defense Authorization Act added 172 of the PFAS substances to the list. That was done in order to be able to get it on there in short order and kind of bypass a few of the much longer processes that normally take place to get new materials on the list. So in this case, they added 172 to be reportable for the calendar year 2020, which was due in July of 2021. And then recently, they're actually adding 3 more for reporting year 2021 that will, of course, be due in July of 2022. And that is based on toxicity and basically the EPA's having looked at whether or not they can quantify and have all the systems in place to be able to make those a reportable material. They have already confirmed that there's going to be another one added. They just haven't given it a date, but it may even impact the 2021, I guess, reporting year. So if it's put into place before the end of this year, then we would also have to consider it for reporting year 2021. The general idea is that they're looking right now, of course, is particularly the PFAS amongst one of the highest, of course, on the radar, is they're looking at to try to see how many of those they can include, because they're collecting information through TSCA and other reporting pathways, I guess, to collect information about who's generating it, who's creating it, who's manufacturing it, and how common of a material it is. And so those that they're screening through, they're going ahead and adding on as soon as they've got conclusive data that says these are toxic materials and used with enough frequency that they really need to be reported. So again, just the idea being that we give this information out to the communities as soon as possible. And since this is so high on the publicity on EPA's radar and in all the courts, then they want to make sure that this information is available as soon as possible. So these are the two basic places where you can, and I think somewhere in here, I don't remember seeing it anymore, but I think we might have taken it out. They have done a great deal in the last 2 years to be able to add in useful tools, kind of screening tools that first will help you look through your NAAQS codes and your applicability. Pretty quick screenings that help you kind of get through those first steps. And they've put a lot of that information up on the EPA TRI website. There's a lot of useful information. These two are kind of the main ones where you can see what has been in your community. You can pull it up by facility, by zip code, or by particular type of industry, and you can collect all of that information. This is publicly available information, and that's really what the intent of this report is for. So these two different links are actually really, really useful if you're trying to find out anything about a given, like I said, industry, facility, your own neighborhood, if that's what you want to look at. That's pretty much it. So if you have any questions, please let us know.